We've been wanting to do Yemen since the beginning of this conflict, and there's so much in the day in the shows to cover on Gaza that we just haven't given. We haven't had the time, but we've wanted to do this for a long time. So, um, shout out to Yemen. This should have come a lot earlier, but yeah. So essentially, Yemen has set up a blockade, a de facto blockade of the strait that goes in from the Arabian Sea into the Red Sea to the Suez Canal, which is a critical shipping route, one of the three most critical shipping routes in the world. And the Yemeni armed forces, under what known in the West as the Houthi movement, named after its leader Abdel Malik al-Houthi, but they call themselves Ansar Allah, and the Yemeni armed forces. And essentially, as a direct response to the blockade and siege on Gaza, the Yemeni armed forces sort of threw down a gauntlet and said, until the siege of Gaza ends, shipping by Israeli companies through the Red Sea wasn't going to happen. And they backed that up with the seizure um, of an Israeli flagged or an Israeli adjacent ship to show that they meant business. But what they have been doing is, before that, they were warning ships not to go. They boarded ships and told them to turn around, and effectively have set up a de facto blockade of Israeli ports and travel through the Red Sea, through the Suez, and into the Mediterranean Sea. So this is a significant shipping route. It's an oil shipping route. It's a container shipping route. It's already an area that's full of warships from all over the world. But the United States has, of course, since October 7th, really buttressed their force in this area. And so it's basically crawling with American warships and destroyers, cruise missile destroyers. And the Yemenis have used their media really well. And of course, they have the support of the Yemeni population, which is overwhelmingly in support of the Palestinians. And I think a lot of people in the Arab world have watched this resistance from the Yemenis joining in this war. And it really stands in stark contrast to, of course, to their repressive governments who don't represent the feeling on the streets. So I think Yemen has found a legitimacy in this blockade and is participating in the war in a consequential manner, opening up a southern front to the war that includes the war in the north with Hezbollah. Now this war in the south. So the Ansar Allah has attacked Eilat as well, southern Israel, principally using ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, loitering drones, which are something that the Yemeni armed forces has a lot of experience with over the past 9 years. Fighting against the Saudi-US coalition that attempted to overthrow their uprising. And so they're not a non-state actor. They have resources of an armed force. And in fact, they have anti-ship capabilities that no other states, very few states have. And so they did this blockade verbally. They expressed how it was going to happen. And then this video that we're seeing right now was from November 19th, when the Yemeni armed forces boarded the Galaxy Leader, which was an Israeli-owned ship. And you can see just even from this video, they have the capabilities. They have radar capabilities to find these ships, and they have helicopter capabilities to land a reaction force onto the ship. So they're not a guerrilla force anymore. They were a guerrilla force in the fight against the Saudis, but they have turned themselves and used the resources of the state to form a considerable, quasi-state force. And so this footage of this taking over this container ship obviously caused a lot of concern in the Western world, and it resulted in the Americans moving an aircraft carrier strike group into the Red Sea in an attempt to protect these ships, which it did not do. It has not worked. There has been more attacks since this ship was taken over. And we can see in this video that it's obviously a complex operation. It involves the helicopters. You see the boats flanking it. And at this point, you also see them flying a Palestinian flag on the roof of the ship. So again, this is a major shipping corridor. 12% of the world's oil, so as much as 30% of U.S. or of international shipping containers at any point can be passing through the Red Sea into the Suez Canal to get into the Mediterranean Sea. And so Ansar Allah has warned ships not to pass. And there has been a considerable effect to this that we have seen. This has been happening for 2 months. But we've seen over the last few days it step up considerably. And this map here shows you what the consequence of closing the Suez Canal is for shipping. It means instead of taking the shortcut, it means you have to traverse all the way around the southern tip of Africa, which can cause delays depending on the shipping from a couple of weeks to a month. The shipping costs, of course, go through the roof because the costs and logistics of the trip become many-fold increased. And so you see this de facto blockade creating a situation that the United States feels like they have to actively be involved in. And here's the State Department's response to this ship, and we can hear the Yemeni response to it. This is from November.
The Houthi seizure of the motor vessel Galaxy Leader in the Red Sea is a flagrant violation of international law. We demand the immediate release of the ship and its crew, and we will consult with our allies and UN partners as appropriate on next steps.
Thank you.
So we demand the release of the ship, and this is the Ansar Allah media representative for their armed forces. He simply says no. And so this kind of defiance and inability to be deterred in the sense that the Western powers always intend with their threats. And we know from Nasrallah's speech that all of these other fronts, Lebanon, that the Americans are phoning constantly behind the scenes, Nasrallah said, threatening everybody, threatening that if they participate, that their countries will be destroyed and sent back to the Stone Age and whatnot. And the Yemenis, who have 9 years of experience fighting the American-Saudi coalition, just simply say no, which is just like a defiance that spreads throughout the Arab world and is a real source of pride for the Palestinians. Abu Ubaidah has, of course, mentioned this. And the Americans have been forced to have warships, missile destroyers that escort their aircraft carriers, actually downing. And then you can see from this map just how many American assets there are in this area that are unable to deal with Yemen, who, depending on how you classify, can be considered the poorest country in the world, devastated by 9 years of war, famine. But their resistance is prompting the Americans to have so many warships that you can barely put it on a map. Like, this map's almost absurd. And they're constantly shooting down ballistic and cruise missiles. And what the Ansar Allah has used to great effect is drone swarms. They use loitering drones or suicide drones, drones that are themselves missile capable, and they flood the area with numerous drones to attempt to get through air defense systems, which is something they did to great effect in Saudi Arabia when they targeted Saudi oil refineries during that war. So essentially what Ansar Allah has done has basically been to draw a line in this area that the Americans are trying to work with their allies to figure out what to do. Because the Yemenis have the capability to shut down shipping to Israel, which is very considerable. So the Israeli economy is already stretched by 360,000 people called up into the reserves. Air traffic has all but stopped into Ben Gurion airport in Tel Aviv. It's just a trickle. And so Israel has lost this sort of core part of their economy, which is like the Jews of the world coming to visit family, what would be called tourism writ large, but a lot of it is family visits and whatnot. So that's been a huge hit to the Israeli economy. Of course, we know that there's no laborers from the West Bank accessing Israel. They've been shut out of Israel. So they've lost hundreds of thousands of West Bank laborers. They lost hundreds of thousands of Gaza laborers when, after the attack, they sealed the border with Gaza. We know that they've lost tens of thousands of Thai workers who were their labor force on their kibbutz farms and whatnot. So there's already those very considerable gouges out of the Israeli economy. We also know that 500,000 Israelis from the north and the south are evacuated from their communities, and they're dependent on the state as well. So the state's putting them up, Israel's putting them up in hotels at considerable cost for an indefinite period of time. And also, just because you've evacuated those communities, there's no basic economy happening in those communities. So shops are all closed. Unemployment's tripled in Israel in the last month, just in the last month. More than 50% of Israeli businesses had lost more than 50% of their revenues that was from the first week in November. So there's a month on top of that. That's been piled on top of that. We know they get those significant airlifts from the Americans, but this basic trade for Israel, its foodstuffs and whatnot, its vehicles. Two of the ships were vehicle ships that had more than 10,000 cars that were headed to Israel. And you can see there's a strait right off the coast of Aden there on the southern tip of Yemen, which has been like the colonizers' prize for the whole time of naval warfare because of its control over that strait, that skinny little piece of land, piece of water in between Yemeni land, that gives them significant pull, and is one of the reasons why the colonists targeted Yemen. But since 1967, Yemen has been independent, and they've been able to use their state apparatus to effectively create a blockade of Israel that's blockading one of the most significant trade routes in the world. And so if you count the number of Israelis that have had to leave their communities, plus the number that's called up, you have almost 1 million people removed from their society, generating income for their state. And on top of that, they need to be paid out by the government. And Netanyahu has talked about setting up a war economy where they're just dumping money into anyone who needs it. So this kind of warfare is not sustainable. And when you put the actual consequences of Ansar Allah running effectively a naval blockade veto over Israeli ports with a basic explanation: end the siege on Gaza, or the blockade will continue. And there's no threat that comes from the Americans. There's no threat that comes from the Americans that deters the Yemenis, because for one thing, they're deeply popular. This position is deeply popular within their society. We saw this demonstration last weekend that I don't even know how you can. Is that 1 million people? Many hundreds of thousands of people. So it's deeply popular, and Ansar Allah has said straightforwardly, we're not afraid of escalating. If you want to escalate this war, we're ready. And countries like the UAE hear that kind of thing, and they're not so sure they want to participate in something that's that has the capability. Yemen has the capability to shut the UAE's ports within minutes. They have the capacity to make people decide which side you're on in this genocide. And the United States has had to respond to this. Actually, just from this Tamara, do we have the spokesperson Yahya Sari riding off from this speech? So he gives this speech in front of what looks like 1 million people. And he doesn't hop into a bulletproof Suburban. He hops on the back of this just regular Yemeni guy's motorcycle, wearing his sandals. And apparently the story goes that Yahya Saree wanted to pay the Yemeni price for the motorcycle ride. And the motorcyclist said, no, it's half off. And so just to show that this is a deeply popular position to be taken. And I'm sure in the UAE, if the UAE's Emirati leadership were to decide to take this position, it would be deeply popular there, of course, because people in the Arab world are watching with horror what's happening, and are embarrassed, ashamed of the role that their governments are playing in this. So yeah, the Yemeni veto, the Yemeni blockade has forced the Americans to set up. So these are a list of the attacks, which generally include drone swarms, but have included some anti-ship missiles that are then forced to be shot down by the American carriers. I have the numbers here somewhere, but it was something on the order of 75 missiles, drones had been shot down since October 7th that are targeting either the ships or, in a lot of cases, targeting Israel itself. And so the U.S. has had to set up, and also just to say, in the last couple of days, the largest shipping companies in the world have decided that they're quitting the Red Sea. So Zim, Hapag-Lloyd, Maersk, Mediterranean Shipping Company, Euronav, the French CMA CGM, and then yesterday BP, British Petroleum, said that they weren't going to ship through the Suez either. So they've created what the BBC called a maritime security crisis by essentially blockading access to Israel until Israel removes the siege on Gaza. And we know that the Yemenis have also targeted American assets. They targeted an MQ-9 Reaper drone earlier in the war, which was a $40 million drone that was flying over Gaza and then moved down to the Red Sea. And the Houthis knocked it out of the air. And so they appear to be ready for this fight. And the United States has now set up, excuse me, just last thing, Ali, that the United States has now set up this naval task force dedicated specifically to combating the Ansar Allah blockade. And they named this operation Operation Prosperity Guardian. So in the midst of the genocide, they have, which you could reword as Operation Protect Capitalism, Operation Protect Imperialism. It's basically the same words, right?
Operation Money.
Yeah, well, it's the considerable loss, the economic legitimacy of Israel in this war is one of the fronts that's in question. And so they've stood up this naval task force that includes
John, let me ask you about this. This is an important point, and that's such a brilliant and detailed overview. So they're setting up this task force, which includes, we can maybe put that back up on the screen. They announced a 10-nation task force, which includes the United Kingdom, Bahrain, Canada, France, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, the Seychelles, and Spain. What's noticeable about that, this is a test of everyone's geography, is that not a single one of those countries actually borders onto the Red Sea. The Seychelles is in the Indian Ocean, but it's not really on the Red Sea. And there have been reports that the United States is trying to bring Egypt into this and trying to bring Jordan into this, and that it tried and failed to bring Saudi Arabia into this, which is very interesting given Saudi Arabia's de facto alliance with Israel, at least prior to this war, and the fact that Jordan is a close ally of the United States. And as we've talked about previously on this live stream and reported, Jordan is actually hosting large numbers of military forces that are part of the sort of regional shield for Israel. That's under Jordan's U.S. security agreement with Israel, the 2021 security agreement. Of course, Jordan denies that the purpose of this is to defend Israel, but that's certainly why the United States is sending the forces there. So the question then about the politics of this, the fact that even the countries like Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia that are very close to the US are unwilling to take part in a naval operation whose purpose, or at least even to give it legitimacy, because they don't know what sort of navies the Saudis or Egypt or the Jordanians have, but they would give it the cover of legitimacy of an operation whose goal is to protect Israel while it perpetrates genocide. So I guess the politics of this don't really work well for the US. What are its options? It's put this task force together. Is it going to start bombing Yemen? And if so, how would that play both politically and militarily?
Yeah, it's like they're trying to make a coalition of the willing, right? From the old Iraq days. And the states that you pointed out, both they can't do it because of their own populations in part, but also they can't do it because they don't want to fight with Yemen. Like I said about the UAE joins that task force and carries out some sort of operation against the Houthis, and they decide that Ansar Allah decides to respond. And now all of a sudden you have this whole different regional war. Like we've talked about the regional war in the north, and where people fall on that divide. But now the Houthis have forced, Ansar Allah has forced people in the south to make these decisions. And so the idea that you're setting up this international task force, I mean, the Ansar Allah responded to that already today and said, if we're attacked, we'll attack back. And they have the capability. I mean, we saw that map earlier with the number of warships that the Americans have in floating off the coast of Yemen. Those are all targets. And we know from previous, from the war with the Saudis, that they're very able to reach those ships. And so the gauntlet has been thrown down, and Ansar Allah has made people decide to pick a side, and they don't appear to be backing down in any way. In fact, like just even collecting the media for this show, like even minutes before we go on the air, they're making statements threatening that they'll reply if you attack us. And so they have this media front that is, doing an excellent job of participating in the information war, maybe the best of anybody, in terms of just like the humor and the disposition that they've taken. And again, we saw those pictures. It's because it's deeply popular within their country. And I don't even know, like, what are those pictures? That is so many people at a demonstration.
And by the way, John, that's not new for Yemen at all.
It's not, no.
And it's incredible, the support from the people of Yemen. But I just want to say something about the language that international media use for this. They call it a blockade, or they call it attacks on shipping, or they call it all sorts of things that give it a negative spin. But what I call it, and I think it's the most accurate term, is this is a humanitarian intervention by Yemen. They are meeting their responsibilities morally and I would say legally under the Genocide Convention to intervene. All countries that ratify the Genocide Convention, I actually don't know, I haven't checked if Yemen has ratified the Genocide Convention. But in any case, in a general sense, the Genocide Convention places on an obligation on governments to intervene. And so that's what Yemen is doing. It's doing what all countries should be doing, intervening to stop the genocide. So this is a true humanitarian intervention, and it's one that is being widely supported across the region. One thing I just noticed, John, while you were speaking, I have the Marine Traffic app on my phone, and you can see there is still quite a bit of traffic going through the Red Sea, bound for the Suez Canal, and those are presumably not ships bound for Israel. But I did notice that some of the ships are now altering their transponder messages to broadcast that they are carrying armed guards. And that's something I'd never seen before. So that's an interesting development.
Yeah, and because of that, the insurance is another thing about the shipping, is that because they have to hire security, that increases the cost as well. And the shipping costs of insurance go up considerably. So when you have high value shipping like oil or vehicles and whatnot, the insurance costs become extraordinary. Some people talked about 8 times the price of what it was originally, once you factor in going all the way around Africa or having armed guards. And essentially that's what these ships are too, right? Like this ship is an operation this naval task force is an operation to protect capitalism, to protect the free flow of goods in the face of a genocide. And as you said, all of these countries that have these warships and have these capabilities, they could be taking those capabilities and taking them off the coast of Israel and resupplying the people in Gaza who are being literally starved to death. They have the capacity, like France, who's joining this coalition, they have the capacity to put a hospital ship or an electrical power station ship off the coast of Gaza. But Israel somehow is allowed to have a de facto blockade. Like the BBC doesn't talk about the siege as a maritime crisis. They don't talk about Gaza as being part of the world, the world trade system. It's like they don't count. They're just inside a prison and they're allowed to be blockaded. But if the Yemenis carry out a humanitarian intervention, the Pentagon, how many weeks did it take the Pentagon to pull together this naval task force, while Yahya Sarri's riding off in his sandals in a crowd of 1 million people? The juxtaposition of those two, and as you say, the juxtaposition of the humanitarian intervention versus the brutal siege on Gaza, It's very stark, and they've put that to the world in a very stark manner. This country that was supposed to lose the war, like the Saudis said that they had won the war against Yemen like 2 weeks into the war, right? Like similar to how the Israelis declared that they had won the war in 2006 in Lebanon after 2 days. But here they are 9 years later, forcing the Americans who were part of that war to come up with a naval task force. So you're not going to deter them. And also they know how to fight. They've been fighting these wars. They're skilled fighters, and they have the apparatus of the state, the Yemeni armed forces, and they're using it.
Yeah. Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.